At 23, Alana Martinez cried during her first military training exercise when a fellow recruit was injured. Her drill sergeant called her emotionally unstable and suggested she transfer to administrative duties. 22 years later, that same too-soft woman would become the oldest female in European military history to earn the coveted Green Beret, completing the most grueling Special Forces selection process on the continent. But the journey from tears to triumph would test every fiber of her being, challenge everything the military thought they knew about strength, and prove that sometimes the softest hearts forge the hardest warriors. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. Alana Martinez had been dismissed as too emotional for combat more times than she could count. But at 45, she still showed up to the Special Forces Selection Course briefing at 0500 hours sharp. The weathered faces around her belonged to men 15 to 20 years younger, each one radiating the kind of aggressive confidence that military culture traditionally rewarded. Alana sat quietly in the back corner, her small frame and gentle demeanor making her nearly invisible among the testosterone-fueled bravado filling the room. What none of them knew was that beneath her soft-spoken exterior lay 22 years of military experience that most of them couldn't match. She'd served in 3 combat deployments, earned expert marksmanship ratings in 4 different weapon systems, and held advanced certifications in psychological operations, tactical medicine, and foreign language intelligence. Her personnel file contained commendations for innovative problem-solving under extreme stress, but those achievements had been systematically overshadowed by a single persistent narrative. Alana Martinez was too sensitive for elite military service. The perception had followed her since basic training at 23, when she'd broken down during a live-fire exercise that left a fellow recruit with severe burns. While medics worked to save the young man's life, Alana had openly wept, her emotional response triggering immediate judgment from superior officers who interpreted her tears as weakness rather than compassion. The incident became a defining moment that would haunt her career for over 2 decades. Emotional liability, her first commanding officer had written in her evaluation, lacks the psychological resilience required for high-stress combat operations. The assessment ignored her exceptional performance in every other metric: tactical thinking, physical fitness, technical skills, leadership potential. Her tears had overshadowed everything else, creating a professional reputation that followed her from base to base like an unwelcome shadow. Now, as she listened to Master Sergeant Klaus Weber outline the brutal requirements of Special Forces selection, Alana felt the familiar weight of skeptical stares. The other candidates weren't openly dismissive. She'd earned enough rank and respect over the years to avoid outright mockery, but their body language spoke volumes. They saw a middle-aged woman who'd spent her career in support roles, finally having some kind of midlife crisis that made her think she could compete with elite warriors. Weber's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. This selection process has a 90% failure rate. Most of you will quit before week 3. Those who remain will face physical challenges that break men half your age, psychological pressures that reveal who you really are under stress, and leadership scenarios where a single wrong decision costs lives. His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Alana with an expression she couldn't quite read. Special Forces isn't about being the strongest or the fastest, Weber continued. It's about being unbreakable when everything falls apart. It's about making the right decision when there is no right decision. It's about leading others through hell when you're not sure you'll survive yourself. The words resonated in Alana's chest like a physical impact. This was exactly what she'd been preparing for her entire career, even when others couldn't see it. After the briefing, candidates gathered in small groups, introducing themselves and sizing up the competition. Alana found herself alone, reviewing the training schedule in silence. She'd learned long ago that first impressions in military settings were rarely favorable for someone with her reputation. Better to let her actions speak rather than attempt to convince skeptics with words. Martinez, right? The voice belonged to Captain Eric Johansson, a 28-year-old infantry officer whose file she'd briefly reviewed. His approach seemed friendly enough, but Alana detected the subtle condescension that often accompanied such interactions. I remember reading about your deployment to Afghanistan. Psychological operations, wasn't it? Among other things, Alana replied neutrally, closing her folder and maintaining eye contact. She'd learned that showing any defensiveness about her background only reinforced negative perceptions. Must be quite a change going from winning hearts and minds to this. Johansson gestured toward the obstacle course visible through the barracks window. I mean, no disrespect, but special forces is pretty different from psychological warfare. What Johansson didn't know was that Alana's psychological operations had included infiltrating enemy-controlled villages, building intelligence networks among hostile populations, and maintaining cover identities while gathering critical battlefield intelligence. Her work had directly contributed to mission successes that saved dozens of lives, but those achievements were classified and couldn't be discussed, with junior officers seeking to understand her motivations. Every skill set has its place, she answered diplomatically. I'm here to learn new ones. As evening approached, Alana sat alone in her assigned bunk, writing in a leather journal she'd maintained throughout her military career. The pages contained tactical observations, leadership lessons, and personal reflections that had helped her survive and thrive in an institution that often seemed designed to exclude people like her. Tonight's entry focused on the psychological dynamics she'd observed during the day's orientation. The other candidates are measuring themselves against each other, looking for weaknesses to exploit and strengths to emulate. They see competition where I see collaboration opportunities. They interpret my quiet observation as disengagement when it's actually data collection. Tomorrow begins the real test of whether emotional intelligence can be as valuable as emotional suppression. Outside her window, the training facility buzzed with activity as candidates engaged in informal competitions and boastful storytelling. She could hear laughter, challenges being issued, and the kind of male bonding rituals that had always made her feel like an outsider. But tonight, instead of feeling excluded, Alana felt strategic. While they exhausted themselves proving their worth to each other, she was conserving energy and gathering intelligence about their personalities, motivations, and potential breaking points. At 45, she understood something that had taken decades to learn. The military's obsession with traditional displays of strength often blinded it to other forms of power. Tomorrow, she would begin demonstrating that emotional depth, psychological insight, and quiet determination could be just as formidable as physical aggression and loud confidence. The last entry in her journal that night was simple but profound. They think my softness is a weakness. They're about to discover it's been my greatest strength all along. The Bavarian Alps Training Center had broken more soldiers than any other facility in European military history, and as dawn broke over the snow-capped peaks, Alana Martinez understood why the location had been chosen for Special Forces selection. The terrain was unforgiving alpine forests that could hide 100 different ways to die, mountain passes where weather changed from pleasant to lethal in minutes, and elevations that left even experienced soldiers gasping for oxygen during basic exercises. Master Sergeant Weber had designed the facility's training regimen based on real-world special operations failures. Every obstacle, every scenario, every psychological pressure test had been reverse-engineered from missions where elite units had broken down under stress. The philosophy was simple. If you couldn't handle controlled suffering at the training center, you'd never survive uncontrolled chaos in actual combat. Welcome to your new reality, Weber announced as 43 candidates assembled in the pre-dawn darkness. 3 men had already quit during the night, leaving their gear neatly folded with resignation letters explaining the family obligations or career reconsiderations had led to their departure. Everyone understood these were face-saving excuses. The truth was that some people looked at what lay ahead and realized they weren't built for it. The first week's schedule was deliberately designed to identify different types of weakness. Physical challenges would eliminate those whose bodies couldn't handle the demands. Psychological pressures would break those whose minds cracked under stress. Leadership scenarios would expose those who folded when others depended on them. But the most insidious aspect of the program was its social dynamics, the way it used peer pressure and cultural expectations to make certain candidates feel like they didn't belong. Alana had researched these dynamics extensively, reading psychological studies about military selection processes and interviewing former Special Forces operators about their experiences. She understood that her biggest enemy wouldn't be the physical challenges or even the psychological pressure tests. It would be the subtle but persistent message that someone like her didn't fit the Special Forces culture. The message started early. During the first equipment inspection, Staff Sergeant Heinrich Mueller, Weber's senior instructor, paused at Alana's station longer than others. Her gear was perfectly organized, her equipment properly maintained, her uniform immaculate. But Muller's attention focused on details that had nothing to do with tactical readiness. "Martinez, you've been in the military for 22 years?" Muller's tone carried a skepticism that made other candidates turn to watch the interaction. "Yes, Staff Sergeant." "And in all that time, you never felt the urge to attempt Special Forces selection until now?" The question was loaded with implications that everyone in the room understood. Why would someone wait until middle age to attempt the military's most challenging program? Was this some kind of publicity stunt? A midlife crisis? An attempt to prove something that should have been proven decades earlier? "I felt ready now, Staff Sergeant." Muller's laugh was cold and dismissive. "Ready. Interesting choice of words." He moved on to the next candidate without further comment, but the damage was done. Every person in that room now understood that the instructors viewed Alana's presence with suspicion. The hostile environment wasn't limited to official interactions. During mealtimes, candidates naturally formed groups based on shared backgrounds and common interests. Infantry officers gravitated toward each other, sharing stories of combat deployments and tactical innovations. Pilots clustered together, discussing aircraft performance and air-to-ground operations. Special operations wannabes from various branches compared their preparation strategies and debated the merits of different training philosophies. Alana found herself consistently excluded from these informal networks. Her background in psychological operations didn't translate easily to casual conversation, especially since most of her significant achievements remained classified. When she attempted to contribute to tactical discussions, her insights were often met with polite but dismissive responses that suggested her perspective wasn't quite relevant to real military operations. "The thing about PSYOPs," Captain Johansson explained to a group of younger officers during lunch, "is that it's more like academic work than actual soldiering. Important, sure, but not the same skill set we need for Special Forces missions." He glanced at Alana apologetically, as if softening the blow made the dismissal less cutting. What frustrated Alana most was the assumption that her emotional awareness made her unsuitable for high-stress leadership. During the second day's team-building exercises, she demonstrated exceptional ability to read group dynamics, identify personality conflicts before they escalated, and find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. But these skills were interpreted through the lens of existing prejudices about her emotional instability. "Martinez thinks too much," she overheard Lieutenant David Kruger telling another candidate. "Special Forces is about instinct and aggression, not psychoanalysis. When bullets start flying, you need people who react, not people who want to discuss feelings." The irony was devastating. Alana's emotional intelligence, which had enabled her to survive and succeed in some of the military's most psychologically demanding roles, was being weaponized against her as evidence that she couldn't handle psychological pressure. Her ability to understand and respond to human nature was dismissed as oversensitivity, while the emotional suppression valued by military culture was celebrated as strength. But the most insidious aspect of the hostile environment was how it made her question herself. After 4 days of subtle but persistent messaging that she didn't belong, Alana found herself second-guessing decisions that would have been automatic in her previous roles. When team leaders were selected for group exercises, she wasn't chosen despite having more leadership experience than most candidates. When technical expertise was needed for equipment challenges, her input was sought last and implemented reluctantly. By the end of the first week, 3 more candidates had quit, and Alana understood that the selection process was as much about cultural conformity as capability. The program wasn't just identifying who could complete difficult tasks, it was identifying who fit the Special Forces image of what elite warriors should look like, sound like, and act like. That evening, she called her sister Elena in Barcelona, needing to hear a friendly voice after 7 days of professional isolation. "How are you holding up, Hermana?" Elena's concern was evident even through the crackling connection. "They want me to quit," Elena admitted quietly, walking outside the barracks to ensure privacy. "Not officially, but they're making it clear that someone like me doesn't belong here." "Someone like you? You mean someone who's devoted their entire adult life to serving their country with distinction? Someone who cries when people get hurt. Someone who thinks about feelings instead of just following orders." Elena's response was immediate and fierce. "Alana, You've been underestimated your entire career, and every single time, you've proven them wrong. Remember what Papa used to say, Los lobos no pierden el sueño por la opinión de las ovejas. Wolves don't lose sleep over the opinions of sheep. Their father's favorite saying had guided Alana through countless difficult moments, but it felt especially relevant now. She was surrounded by people who mistook her thoughtfulness for weakness, her emotional depth for instability, her different approach for inferiority. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now let's return to the narrative. As she ended the call and returned to the barracks, Alana made a decision that would define the rest of her selection experience. Instead of trying to fit the mold that others expected, she would embrace exactly who she was and demonstrate that emotional strength could be just as powerful as emotional suppression. The hostile environment wasn't going to change, but her response to it could evolve into something they'd never seen before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for others to underestimate her, and new chances to prove that the military's definition of strength might be dangerously incomplete. She'd spent a week being treated like an outsider. Now it was time to show them what outsiders could accomplish when they stopped trying to fit in and started focusing on standing out. 3 weeks into selection, the pattern of dismissal had become so predictable that Alana could anticipate it before it happened. During morning briefings, Master Sergeant Weber would outline complex tactical scenarios, and when discussion opened for candidate input, the instructor's eyes would systematically skip over her raised hand. When her insights were eventually acknowledged, they were received with polite nods before being set aside in favor of more conventional approaches suggested by male candidates with less experience. The most painful example occurred during a hostage rescue simulation. The scenario involved a terrorist cell holding civilians in a mountain cabin, with multiple variables designed to test tactical thinking under extreme pressure. Intelligence suggested the captors were psychologically unstable, making traditional assault tactics potentially catastrophic for hostage survival. Alana immediately recognized elements from real-world situations she'd encountered during psychological operations deployments. Staff Sergeant, she'd raised her hand during the planning phase. The intelligence profile suggests these aren't professionally trained terrorists. They're emotionally driven, which means they're unpredictable but also vulnerable to psychological manipulation. A direct assault could trigger panic responses that endanger the hostages. Lieutenant Kruger, who'd been designated team leader for the exercise, nodded dismissively. Thanks for the input, Martinez, but we need to focus on actionable intelligence, not psychological theories. He turned to the other candidates. Standard breach protocol. Alpha team takes the front, Bravo team covers the rear, Charlie team provides overwatch. Alana watched in frustration as the team implemented a textbook assault plan that ignored every psychological indicator from the intelligence briefing. Her 22 years of experience in reading human behavior under stress, her advanced training in psychological operations, her actual field experience with similar scenarios all dismissed as theoretical by someone with a fraction of her background. The simulation proceeded exactly as she'd predicted. The mock assault triggered panic among the role-playing captors, resulting in simulated hostage casualties that could have been prevented with a more psychologically informed approach. When the exercise concluded, Weber's debrief focused on tactical execution rather than strategic planning, treating the hostage losses as acceptable collateral damage rather than preventable failures. Martinez, Weber called out during the critique session, you seem to have something to say about the outcome. Yes, Staff Sergeant. The psychological profile clearly indicated that these captors would respond violently to direct confrontation. A negotiation-based approach combined with psychological pressure tactics could have resolved the situation without hostage casualties. Captain Johansson laughed, not maliciously, but with the kind of patronizing amusement that was somehow worse than open hostility. This is Special Forces selection, not a psychology seminar. We're training warriors, not therapists. The comment drew chuckles from several other candidates, and Alana felt the familiar sting of professional dismissal. What none of them understood was that her psychological approach had prevented actual hostage casualties in 3 separate real-world operations during her deployments. Her insights weren't theoretical, they were battle-tested and life-saving. But the pattern wasn't limited to tactical scenarios. During physical training sessions, her performance was consistently evaluated through a lens that emphasized her limitations rather than her capabilities. When she completed a grueling mountain march in the middle of the pack, the focus was on her slower pace rather than her completion of a challenge that eliminated two younger, supposedly stronger candidates. When she excelled in technical skills assessments, her success was attributed to book learning rather than practical competence. The psychological toll was insidious. After each dismissal, Alana found herself questioning decisions that should have been automatic. During navigation exercises, she second-guessed her instincts about terrain and weather patterns, wondering if her judgments were being influenced by emotions rather than tactical analysis. During leadership rotations, she hesitated to assert authority, knowing that any display of confidence would be interpreted as overcompensation for underlying insecurity. The breaking point came during Week 4, when Staff Sergeant Mueller announced that candidates would be evaluated on their ability to provide peer feedback. Each person would assess the strengths and weaknesses of their teammates, with the understanding that these evaluations would influence selection decisions. The exercise was designed to identify leadership potential and team compatibility, but Alana recognized it as an opportunity for personal biases to masquerade as professional assessment. Martinez demonstrates strong technical knowledge, Lieutenant Becker wrote in his evaluation, which she glimpsed during a paperwork exchange. However, her emotional responses to high-stress situations raise questions about suitability for special operations environments where psychological resilience is paramount. The assessment was devastating in its calculated ambiguity. Becker had never witnessed her having an emotional response during selection. He was referencing her reputation from decades earlier, using second-hand information to justify present-day discrimination. But the evaluation would carry official weight, becoming part of her permanent record regardless of its accuracy or relevance. Similar patterns emerged in other peer evaluations she managed to observe. Candidates praised her intelligence and dedication while questioning her cultural fit with Special Forces teams. They acknowledged her experience while suggesting it wasn't the right kind of experience for elite operations. They recognized her problem-solving abilities while implying that overthinking could be dangerous in fast-moving tactical situations. The irony was maddening. Every strength was reframed as a potential weakness, every capability was qualified with concerns about cultural compatibility, every achievement was diminished by questions about emotional stability. She was being evaluated not on what she could do, but on whether she conformed to pre-existing expectations about what a Special Forces operator should look like and act like. During a particularly difficult evening, after receiving feedback that praised her, quote, administrative skills while questioning her warrior mindset, Alana sat alone in the barracks writing in her journal. The entries from recent weeks revealed a disturbing pattern, her confidence eroding, her decision-making becoming tentative, her natural instincts being suppressed in favor of behaviors she thought others wanted to see. "I'm becoming exactly what they expect me to be," she wrote. Tentative, second-guessing, apologetic for taking up space. 22 years of military service, and I'm letting a handful of junior officers convince me that everything I've accomplished was somehow inadequate or irrelevant. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd spent weeks trying to prove herself worthy of acceptance, when she should have been demonstrating why their definition of worthiness was fundamentally flawed. Her emotional intelligence wasn't a liability. It was exactly the kind of capability that modern warfare demanded. Her psychological insight wasn't theoretical. It was practical skill that had saved lives in real combat situations. As she closed her journal that night, Alana made a decision that would change the trajectory of her selection experience. Tomorrow, instead of apologizing for who she was, she would start showing them who she could become when she stopped trying to fit their mold and started breaking it entirely. The pattern of dismissal had nearly broken her spirit, but it had also revealed something crucial about the selection process. They weren't just testing physical and tactical capabilities. They were testing conformity to cultural expectations that might be dangerously outdated. And if that was the test, Alana was about to provide them with an education they'd never forget. Dr. Sarah Connor arrived at the Bavarian Alps Training Center on a Tuesday morning in October, bringing with her 15 years of combat psychology research and a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions about military culture. As the newly assigned psychological evaluator for Special Forces selection, she'd been tasked with developing more sophisticated assessment methods that could identify psychological resilience while eliminating cultural bias from the evaluation process. Her first observation session coincided with a complex leadership exercise, where candidates were rotated through command positions during simulated combat scenarios. Dr. Connor positioned herself where she could observe both tactical performance and group dynamics, taking detailed notes about how different personality types responded to pressure and how teams functioned under various leadership styles. What she witnessed during Alana's leadership rotation fundamentally challenged her assumptions about military effectiveness. While other candidates relied on aggressive command styles and rigid adherence to established protocols, Alana demonstrated something entirely different: adaptive leadership that responded to real-time psychological and tactical intelligence. The scenario involved a mock prisoner rescue, where intelligence was deliberately incomplete and contradictory. Previous team leaders had approached the challenge by making quick decisions based on limited information, prioritizing action over analysis. Their results have been mixed at best, with several simulations ending in preventable casualties due to hasty tactical choices. When Alana assumed command, her first action was something Dr. Connor had never seen in Special Forces training. She called for a psychological assessment of the available intelligence before making tactical decisions. Instead of immediately planning an assault, she spent crucial minutes analyzing the captor's likely mental state, their probable motivations, and their expected responses to different types of pressure. According to the intelligence briefing, Alana explained to her team, these captors have been isolated for 6 days without communication from their handlers. That suggests psychological pressure is building. They're probably arguing among themselves, questioning their mission, and becoming increasingly unstable. A direct assault could trigger panic, but a psychological approach might exploit existing fractures in their group dynamics. Dr. Connor watched as Alana implemented a strategy that combined traditional tactical elements with sophisticated psychological warfare. Instead of rushing the compound, she orchestrated a series of carefully calibrated pressure tactics: controlled noise designed to increase stress levels, strategic positioning that created paranoia about being surrounded, and negotiation attempts that deliberately targeted the most psychologically vulnerable captor. The approach worked flawlessly. Within 40 minutes, the mock captors had surrendered without firing a shot, the hostages were recovered unharmed, and the tactical objective was achieved with 0 casualties. It was the most successful outcome of any simulation Dr. Connor had observed, accomplished through methods that conventional military training didn't even acknowledge as valid options. After the exercise, Dr. Connor approached Alana during the debriefing period. "Sergeant Martinez, could I speak with you privately?" Quote, They walked to a quiet area overlooking the mountain training ranges, where Dr. Connor began a conversation that would change the trajectory of Alana's selection experience. "I've been observing military training for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone integrate psychological analysis with tactical planning the way you just did. Where did you learn those techniques?" "Real-world experience," Alana replied carefully, unsure whether this was another evaluation disguised as casual conversation. "Psychological operations deployments taught me that understanding human behavior can be just as important as understanding terrain or equipment." Dr. Connor nodded thoughtfully. "Your personnel file mentions several classified operations, but it doesn't detail your specific contributions. Can you tell me about a situation where psychological insight made the difference between mission success and failure?" For the first time in weeks, Alana felt safe discussing her actual capabilities with someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than judging. She described a hostage situation in Afghanistan where traditional assault tactics would have resulted in civilian casualties, but psychological profiling had enabled her team to identify and exploit interpersonal conflicts among the captors. The lead captor was a local religious extremist, but his followers were motivated primarily by money rather than ideology, Alana explained. "By understanding their different psychological drivers, we were able to create conditions where the mercenaries abandoned their leader rather than fighting to the death. 3 hostages came home safely because we treated it as a human dynamics problem rather than purely a tactical challenge." Dr. Connor's evaluation was taking an unexpected turn. Instead of questioning Alana's emotional stability, she was documenting evidence of extraordinary psychological insight applied to real-world military operations. "How do you think your approach differs from what you've observed during selection?" "Most of the other candidates are excellent tactical thinkers," Alana answered diplomatically, "but they tend to treat every problem as if it has a kinetic solution. Sometimes the most effective approach is understanding why people behave the way they do, then using that understanding to achieve objectives without violence. Over the following days, Connor made it her mission to observe Alana's interactions with other candidates and instructors. What she discovered was a disturbing pattern of systematic bias that had nothing to do with capability assessment and everything to do with cultural conformity. Alana's insights were being dismissed not because they were wrong, but because they challenged established assumptions about how elite military operations should be conducted. Dr. Connor began documenting specific instances where Alana's recommendations were ignored despite being tactically sound. She recorded conversations where instructors questioned Alana's emotional stability without providing concrete examples of problematic behavior. She noted how peer evaluations consistently praised Alana's competence while questioning her cultural fit, creating a professional double bind where excellence was simultaneously acknowledged and dismissed. The turning point came when Dr. Connor reviewed video footage of the hostage rescue simulation that had showcased Alana's unique capabilities. Master Sergeant Weber's official assessment had focused on non-standard tactical approaches and over-reliance on psychological theory, rather than acknowledging the superior results achieved through innovative problem-solving. "This is concerning," Dr. Connor told Weber during a private meeting. "You're evaluating methodology rather than outcomes. Martinez achieved the best simulation results we've recorded, but her assessment suggests she performed poorly." Weber's response revealed the depth of institutional bias at work. Dr. Connor: "Special Forces requires operators who can function effectively within established tactical frameworks. Martinez's approach might work in controlled environments, but it's not consistent with how we conduct actual operations. Have you considered that your actual operations might be more effective if they incorporated psychological analysis?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the traditional Special Forces culture represented. Weber's discomfort was evident, but Dr. Connor pressed forward. "The data suggests that psychological insight correlates with mission success, especially in complex scenarios involving civilian populations or non-traditional adversaries. Martinez isn't proposing we abandon tactical training, she's demonstrating how to enhance it." Dr. Connor's support came at a crucial moment when Alana's confidence was at its lowest point. That evening, she invited Alana for coffee in the base cafe, creating an informal environment where honest conversation could occur without the weight of official evaluation. "I want you to know that what you're experiencing here isn't about your capabilities," Dr. Connor said directly. "You're being evaluated against cultural expectations that may not align with actual operational requirements. The question isn't whether you're good enough for Special Forces. The question is whether Special Forces is evolved enough to recognize what you bring to the table." For the first time in weeks, Alana felt understood by someone within the military hierarchy. Dr. Connor's validation didn't just acknowledge her technical capabilities, it recognized the psychological toll of being constantly underestimated despite demonstrating superior performance. "What happens now?" Alana asked. "Now we document everything, your innovative approaches, your superior results, and the institutional resistance you're facing. Because sometimes the system needs to be confronted with evidence that its assumptions are limiting its effectiveness." Dr. Connor's alliance provided Alana with something she'd been missing throughout the selection process: an advocate who understood both her capabilities and the systemic challenges she faced. But more importantly, it gave her permission to stop apologizing for her strengths and start demonstrating why emotional intelligence and psychological insight were exactly the capabilities that modern warfare demanded. The supportive ally had arrived at the perfect moment, just when Alana needed to remember that the problem wasn't her approach to military operations. The problem was a culture that couldn't recognize innovation when it was staring them in the face. By week 6 of selection, Alana's frustration had evolved from professional disappointment into something approaching existential crisis. Despite consistently outperforming expectations in technical assessments, demonstrating innovative solutions to complex tactical problems, and maintaining physical fitness standards that eliminated candidates half her age, she could feel the invisible walls of institutional bias closing in around her future. The breaking point came during a multi-day field exercise designed to test leadership under extreme stress. Candidates were divided into teams and given overlapping missions that deliberately created resource conflicts and communication challenges. The scenario was engineered to reveal how individuals responded when traditional military hierarchy broke down and survival depended on collaborative problem-solving rather than rigid adherence to chain of command. Alana found herself assigned to Team Charlie, led by Captain Eric Johansson, whose confidence in conventional tactics had only grown stronger as the selection process eliminated candidates with less traditional backgrounds. Their mission involved establishing a forward observation post while coordinating with 2 other teams to secure a valley suspected of harboring enemy forces. The intelligence was deliberately vague, requiring teams to make critical decisions based on incomplete information and evolving tactical situations. From the beginning, Johansson's approach ignored the psychological complexity of the scenario. He divided responsibilities based on rank and conventional expertise, assigning Alana to communications and logistics while taking point on tactical decision-making. When she attempted to contribute insights about enemy behavior patterns suggested by the intelligence briefing, he dismissed her input as irrelevant to immediate operational needs. "Martinez, we need you focused on maintaining radio contact with base camp, not psychoanalyzing hypothetical enemies," Johansson had said during the initial planning session. "Let the infantry officers handle tactical assessment." What followed was a textbook example of how conventional military thinking could fail catastrophically when faced with unconventional challenges. Johansson's team established their observation post according to standard protocols, focusing on fields of fire and defensive positioning while ignoring the psychological factors that influenced enemy movement patterns in mountainous terrain. Alana recognized immediately that their position, while tactically sound by traditional standards, was psychologically predictable. Enemy forces familiar with American military doctrine would expect exactly this type of positioning. But when she raised concerns about the predictability of their approach, her warnings were dismissed as overthinking that could undermine team cohesion. The simulated enemy attack came exactly where Alana had predicted it would, exploiting psychological assumptions about American tactical preferences rather than challenging their physical defensive capabilities. Team Charlie found themselves caught in a crossfire that their conventional positioning hadn't anticipated, forced to abandon their observation post and retreat to secondary positions while their mission objectives remained unfulfilled. During the post-exercise debrief, Master Sergeant Weber's analysis focused on execution rather than planning, treating the tactical failure as a consequence of individual performance issues rather than flawed strategic assumptions. Johansson's leadership was praised for maintaining unit cohesion under fire, while the fundamental problems with their approach went unaddressed. Martinez, Weber had called out during the critique session, "Your communication protocols were adequate, but team leaders reported that you seemed distracted by secondary concerns instead of focusing on your assigned responsibilities." The assessment was maddeningly unfair. Alana's distraction had been her attempt to prevent a tactical disaster that unfolded exactly as she'd predicted. Her secondary concerns were the psychological insights that could have led to mission success instead of simulated casualties. But in the rigid framework of traditional military evaluation, her superior understanding of enemy psychology was treated as a failure to stay in her lane. The pattern repeated itself throughout the field exercise. During night operations, Alana's insights about enemy sleep patterns and psychological vulnerabilities were ignored in favor of conventional assault timings that resulted in increased resistance and simulated casualties. During resource allocation challenges, her understanding of group psychology under stress was dismissed as irrelevant to practical logistics decisions, even when her recommendations proved more effective than traditional approaches. Most frustrating was the way her successes were systematically reframed or minimized. When her psychological assessment of a mock prisoner led to critical intelligence breakthroughs, the success was attributed to good luck rather than analytical skill. When her understanding of local cultural psychology prevented a diplomatic incident during a simulated civilian interaction, the outcome was treated as a fortunate accident rather than professional competence. The psychological toll was devastating. Alana found herself lying awake at night, replaying conversations and second-guessing decisions that she knew were correct. The constant dismissal of her expertise was creating a form of professional gaslighting that made her question her own judgment and capabilities. After 22 years of military service, she was being made to feel like an incompetent amateur whose insights were more liability than asset. Her journal entries from this period revealed the depth of her internal struggle. Week 6, Day 3, another exercise where my predictions proved accurate and my recommendations were ignored. Johansson's approach failed exactly as I anticipated. but pointing this out makes me seem like I'm undermining team leadership. How do you prove your value to people who refuse to measure what you're good at? Week 6, Day 5, Dr. Connor says the problem is institutional bias, not my capabilities. But knowing that doesn't make it easier to watch missions fail, because conventional thinking can't adapt to unconventional challenges. I'm starting to understand why so few women attempt Special Forces selection. It's not just the physical demands, it's the psychological warfare of constantly being told, your strengths don't matter. The mounting frustration was compounded by watching younger, less experienced candidates receive recognition for implementing inferior solutions to problems she'd already solved more effectively. Lieutenant Becker was praised for tactical innovations that were actually variations of approaches Alana had suggested weeks earlier. Captain Johansson received leadership commendations for managing crises that her psychological insights could have prevented entirely. Dr. Connor noticed the changes in Alana's demeanor during their weekly psychological evaluations. The confident, analytically minded professional who'd arrived 6 weeks earlier was being replaced by someone who seemed increasingly uncertain about her own judgment and reluctant to offer insights that might be dismissed. They're breaking you down, Dr. Connor observed during a particularly difficult session. Not through legitimate evaluation, but through systematic dismissal of everything that makes you exceptional. This isn't about your fitness for Special Forces, this is about their discomfort with capabilities they don't understand. But what if they're right? Alana asked, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger each day. What if my approach really isn't suitable for special operations? What if I'm just too different to function effectively in their culture? Dr. Connor's response was immediate and fierce. Alana, you've demonstrated superior tactical thinking, innovative problem-solving, and leadership capabilities that exceed most of the other candidates. The only thing you're too different for is a military culture that's afraid to evolve beyond its comfort zone. The conversation marked a turning point in Alana's psychological journey. She realized that her mounting frustration wasn't evidence of personal inadequacy, it was a rational response to institutional dysfunction. The selection process wasn't just testing her capabilities. It was testing her willingness to abandon everything that made her exceptional in order to conform to expectations that might be fundamentally flawed. As Week 6 concluded, Alana faced a choice that would define not just her military career, but her sense of self-worth. She could continue trying to prove herself worthy of acceptance by traditional standards, or she could start demonstrating why those standards needed to evolve. The mounting frustration had brought her to a crossroads where compromise meant abandoning her authentic strengths, while authenticity meant challenging everything the institution claimed to value. The decision would come sooner than she expected, and when it did, it would change not just her own trajectory, but the entire culture's understanding of what strength really meant. Winter arrived early at the Bavarian Alps Training Center, bringing with it weather conditions that transformed routine training exercises into legitimate survival challenges. By week 8 of selection, only 19 candidates remained from the original 43. And the psychological pressure of impending final evaluations was beginning to reveal cracks in even the most composed personalities. But beneath the surface tension of individual performance anxiety, a more serious crisis was developing, one that would test the entire selection program's ability to distinguish between genuine leadership and institutional prejudice. The crisis began with what appeared to be a routine announcement during the Monday morning briefing. Master Sergeant Weber, flanked by his senior instructors, outlined the final phase of selection, a 72-hour field exercise combining all elements of Special Forces operations navigation, combat scenarios, prisoner handling, civilian interaction, and crisis management. Teams would be evaluated not just on mission completion, but on their ability to adapt to unexpected complications and maintain operational effectiveness under extreme stress. "Gentlemen," Weber announced, his eyes briefly acknowledging Alana's presence before returning to the predominantly male audience, "this exercise will determine who receives the Green Beret recommendation. Everything you've learned over the past 8 weeks will be tested simultaneously. There will be no second chances, no do-overs, and no excuses for failure." What Weber didn't announce was the additional layer of complexity that had been added to the exercise based on recent intelligence reports. Dr. Connor had been briefed separately about credible threats to the training facility, threats that suggested enemy operatives had been monitoring the selection process and planning to exploit the final exercise for propaganda purposes. The scenario would include real-world security challenges that went far beyond typical training parameters. Alana sensed the undercurrent of tension immediately. Her psychological training had taught her to read group dynamics and individual stress patterns, and something about the instructor's behavior suggested information was being withheld. During equipment preparation, she noticed additional communication gear being distributed, modifications to standard protocols that indicated elevated security concerns, and briefing materials that seemed unusually detailed about civilian encounter procedures. Her attempts to discuss these observations with other candidates were met with dismissive responses that had become frustratingly familiar. When she mentioned her concerns to Captain Johansson, he waved them off as typical pre-exercise anxiety. When she raised questions about the enhanced security protocols with Lieutenant Kruger, he suggested she was overthinking routine precautions. "Martinez, you always see conspiracies where the rest of us see standard operating procedures," Kruger had said with barely concealed exasperation. "Maybe that's why psychological operations didn't work out for you the first time." The comment was particularly cutting because it revealed how her classified background had been misinterpreted by colleagues who lacked security clearance to understand her actual achievements. Her transition from psychological operations to general infantry roles hadn't been due to failure, it had been due to mission completion and career progression. But the incomplete information available to junior officers allowed them to construct narratives that supported their existing biases about her capabilities. Dr. Connor found Alana that evening in the equipment preparation area, methodically checking and rechecking her gear with the obsessive attention to detail that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. The psychological evaluator had been monitoring stress levels among all candidates, but she was particularly concerned about Alana's emotional state as the culminating exercise approached. "How are you feeling about the final evaluation?" Dr. Connor asked, settling beside Alana on one of the equipment benches. "Something's wrong," Alana replied immediately. "The security protocols are inconsistent with routine training exercises. The instructor briefings included information that suggests they're preparing for real-world complications, not simulated scenarios. Either there's a specific threat they're not telling us about, or this exercise is designed to test our response to genuine crisis situations." Dr. Connor's expression confirmed Alana's suspicions. As the psychological evaluator, she'd been briefed on the security concerns that had prompted modifications to the final exercise. Intelligence agencies had identified online chatter suggesting that extremist groups were planning to target the Special Forces selection process, either through direct attack or by infiltrating the exercise to gather intelligence about American tactical procedures. "I can't discuss specific threat assessments," Dr. Connor said carefully, "but your instincts about enhanced security are correct. The question is whether the other candidates are picking up on the same signals." "They're not," Alana replied with certainty. "They're interpreting any deviation from standard protocols as routine variation, not evidence of genuine security concerns. Their focus on traditional tactical thinking is making them blind to environmental indicators that don't fit established patterns." This was exactly what Dr. Connor had been documenting throughout the selection process. Alana's ability to synthesize information from multiple sources and identify patterns that eluded more conventionally trained observers. Her psychological background enabled her to read situations holistically, recognizing when human behavior patterns suggested underlying complications that might not be immediately obvious through tactical analysis alone. "What concerns you most about tomorrow's exercise?" Dr. Connor asked. Alana paused her equipment preparation and looked directly at the evaluator. "I'm concerned that if something goes wrong, if there's a genuine security threat or unexpected crisis, the leadership structure they've established won't be flexible enough to respond effectively. Traditional military hierarchy works well for predictable scenarios, but real emergencies require adaptive thinking and psychological insight." "And you don't think the selected team leaders possess those capabilities?" "I think they possess excellent technical skills and conventional tactical thinking," Alana replied diplomatically. "But this selection process has consistently rewarded conformity over innovation, traditional approaches over adaptive problem-solving. If tomorrow's exercise includes genuine complications, the teams might find themselves unprepared for scenarios that don't have textbook solutions." Dr. Connor realized she was witnessing something unprecedented, a candidate who was more concerned about collective mission success than individual performance evaluation. While other candidates were focused on personal achievement during the final exercise, Alana was analyzing systemic vulnerabilities that could affect everyone's safety and success. "What would you do differently if you were designing tomorrow's leadership structure?" Dr. Connor asked. "I'd make sure each team included someone with psychological operations experience," Alana answered immediately. not necessarily in a leadership role, but in an advisory capacity. Real-world crises almost always include human dynamics that can't be solved through kinetic action alone. Whether it's managing panic among civilian populations, negotiating with hostile forces, or maintaining team cohesion under extreme stress, psychological insight can make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Weber, who appeared somewhat surprised to find Dr. Connor engaged in detailed discussion with one of the candidates. His expression suggested that such informal consultation might be inappropriate so close to final evaluations. "Dr. Connor, I need to speak with you about tomorrow's assessment protocols," Weber said, his tone indicating that Alana's presence was no longer welcome. As Alana gathered her equipment and prepared to leave, she caught Weber's final comment to Dr. Connor. "We need to ensure that tomorrow's exercise evaluates candidates' ability to function within established command structures, not their tendency to second-guess operational decisions." The statement revealed the fundamental disconnect that had shaped Alana's entire selection experience. The program was designed to identify individuals who could excel within existing frameworks, while the evolving nature of modern warfare increasingly demanded people who could innovate beyond those frameworks when circumstances required adaptation. That night, as candidates made final preparations for the culminating exercise, Alana faced a familiar choice. She could suppress her insights about the brewing crisis and focus on demonstrating conventional tactical competence, or she could trust her analytical instincts and prepare for complications that others weren't anticipating. Her journal entry that evening was brief but profound. "Tomorrow will reveal whether 8 weeks of being underestimated has prepared me to recognize opportunities that others miss, or whether I've been so focused on proving my worth that I've lost sight of what actually matters." Either way, if there's a real crisis, someone needs to be ready to think beyond the textbook. The brewing crisis was about to test more than individual candidacy. It was about to reveal whether military culture was capable of recognizing that its greatest strength might come from embracing perspectives it had spent decades systematically excluding. The final exercise began at 0500 hours on a crisp November morning, with 19 candidates divided into 3 teams and deployed across a 50-square-kilometer training area that encompassed mountain ridges, dense forests, and a simulated village populated by role-playing civilians. Each team received identical mission parameters: establish surveillance on suspected enemy operations, gather intelligence through civilian interaction, and prepare tactical recommendations for follow-on forces. What none of them knew was that the exercise would become devastatingly real within the first 6 hours. Team Alpha, led by Captain Johansson, included Alana and 5 other candidates tasked with the northeastern sector. Their area of operations centered around a remote mountain hamlet, where local actors were portraying villagers caught between government forces and insurgent sympathizers. The scenario required delicate balance between tactical objectives and civilian protection, exactly the kind of complex human dynamics that conventional military training often oversimplified. From the beginning, Johansson's approach ignored the psychological complexities that Alana immediately recognized. His briefing focused on physical terrain, defensive positions, and extraction routes, while treating civilian interaction as a secondary concern that could be managed through standard hearts and minds protocols. When Alana attempted to discuss the cultural psychology briefing materials, he dismissed her input as unnecessarily complicated for what he characterized as a straightforward reconnaissance mission. "Martinez, we need intelligence about enemy positions, not anthropological analysis of village social structures," Johansson had said during their initial planning session. "Keep the civilian interactions professional and efficient. We're here to gather tactical intelligence, not conduct social work." The first sign of real trouble came at 0800 hours, when Team Alpha encountered their first group of civilian role players. What should have been a routine information-gathering exercise immediately revealed fundamental problems with Johansson's approach. The actors, portraying villagers suspicious of military presence, responded to conventional questioning techniques with the kind of defensive hostility that Alana recognized as psychologically authentic rather than theatrical. Her attempts to suggest alternative engagement strategies were dismissed as overthinking the scenario. When she pointed out that the villagers' body language and verbal responses suggested genuine fear rather than role-playing, Johansson accused her of being unable to distinguish between training exercises and real-world operations. The irony was devastating. Her ability to read authentic human psychology was being criticized as a failure to understand artificial scenarios. The catastrophic event began at 1,130 hours, when what everyone believed was part of the training exercise revealed itself as something far more dangerous. A group of armed men approached the village from the southern ridgeline, moving with tactical precision that seemed impressively realistic until Alana noticed details that didn't match training protocols. Their equipment was non-standard, their communication patterns were wrong, and their psychological demeanor suggested genuine operational stress rather than training exercise confidence. "Those aren't role players," Alana told Johansson urgently, studying the approaching figures through her binoculars. "Their movement patterns, equipment configuration, and behavioral indicators are inconsistent with training personnel. These are real operatives conducting an actual operation." Johansson's response revealed the dangerous gap between conventional military thinking and adaptive threat assessment. "Martinez, everything in this exercise is designed to seem realistic. That's the point of advanced training scenarios. Stop trying to turn routine exercises into crisis situations." But Alana's psychological training had taught her to recognize authentic stress responses, and what she was observing through her binoculars was genuine tactical anxiety rather than training exercise performance. The approaching operatives were moving like people whose lives depended on mission success, not like instructors conducting educational scenarios. Their radio communications, which she could partially intercept, included references to real-world locations and operational timelines that had nothing to do with the training exercise. The truth became undeniable when the armed group reached the village and immediately began implementing prisoner control measures that violated every training safety protocol. Instead of interacting with civilian role players according to exercise parameters, they were treating villagers as actual security threats, using restraint techniques and intimidation tactics that were far beyond acceptable training simulation boundaries. "Base Command, this is Team Alpha," Johansson finally radioed, his voice betraying uncertainty as he realized the situation had evolved beyond his understanding. "We're observing unusual activity in the village area. Request clarification of exercise parameters." The response came not from Master Sergeant Weber but from an unfamiliar voice using emergency communication protocols. "All training teams, this is actual base security. Exercise is suspended. Real-world security incident in progress. Maintain positions and await further instructions." The confirmation hit Team Alpha like a physical blow. What they'd been treating as an advanced training scenario was actually a genuine security crisis. Enemy operatives had infiltrated the exercise area, possibly using the training scenario as cover for intelligence gathering or direct action against American military personnel. The elaborate psychological pressures they'd been experiencing weren't educational challenges, they were real operational stresses with potentially lethal consequences. Johansson's immediate response revealed why conventional tactical thinking could fail catastrophically when faced with unexpected psychological complexity. His training had prepared him for kinetic combat scenarios where enemies could be identified, located, and engaged through established protocols. But this situation involved hostile operatives who were embedded among civilian role players, using psychological manipulation and information warfare rather than direct military confrontation. "What's our tactical response?" Lieutenant Kruger asked, his voice tight with stress as he realized their conventional preparation hadn't anticipated this kind of hybrid scenario. "We establish defensive positions and wait for backup," Johansson replied, falling back on standard tactical doctrine. But his approach ignored the psychological dimensions that were driving the crisis. The enemy operatives weren't trying to engage in direct combat. They were attempting to gather intelligence about American Special Forces selection processes, while potentially taking hostages among the civilian role players. Alana recognized immediately that traditional defensive tactics would play directly into the enemy's psychological strategy. By treating this as a conventional military engagement, Team Alpha would be giving the operatives exactly what they wanted: an opportunity to observe American tactical responses under stress while using civilian populations as human shields. "Captain," she said urgently, "this isn't a kinetic situation. These operatives are conducting psychological warfare and intelligence gathering. If we respond with conventional tactics, we're giving them operational intelligence while endangering the civilian actors who are now genuine hostages." "Martinez, this is not the time for psychological theories," Johansson snapped, his stress revealing the brittle foundation of his leadership under genuine pressure. "We have hostile forces in the operational area. We establish defensive positions and neutralize threats, according to tactical doctrine." But as Team Alpha moved into defensive positions, Alana could see the psychological trap that was being sprung around them. The enemy operatives were using the training scenario's civilian population as both intelligence sources and human shields, while documenting American tactical responses for future operational planning. Every conventional military action that Johansson ordered was providing valuable intelligence to hostile forces while increasing danger to innocent people. The catastrophic event had revealed something that 8 weeks of training had failed to address. When genuine crisis struck, conventional tactical thinking could become a liability rather than an asset. The enemy wasn't playing by traditional military rules, and American forces trained exclusively in traditional military responses were finding themselves psychologically and tactically unprepared for hybrid warfare scenarios. As hostile operatives tightened their control over the village and Team Alpha struggled to adapt to a situation their training hadn't anticipated, it became clear that someone would need to think beyond established doctrine to resolve the crisis. The question was whether military culture could recognize that its survival might depend on embracing exactly the kind of innovative thinking it had spent 8 weeks systematically dismissing. The catastrophic event wasn't just testing individual candidates, it was testing the entire military system's ability to evolve beyond its comfort zone, when evolution became the difference between mission success and devastating failure. Radio communications crackled with urgent updates, as the scope of the security crisis became clear to all 3 training teams scattered across the mountain operations area. Intelligence reports suggested that a minimum of 12 enemy operatives had infiltrated the exercise, using the training scenario as cover for a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation. Civilian role players were now genuine hostages, training instructors were potentially compromised, and 19 Special Forces candidates found themselves in the middle of a real-world crisis that their 8 weeks of selection had never prepared them to handle. Team Alpha remained pinned in overwatch positions above the village, watching helplessly as enemy operatives consolidated control over buildings and began systematic interrogation of civilian actors. Captain Johansson's conventional tactical approach had devolved into paralysis as he struggled to adapt established protocols to a situation that defied traditional military categories. His radio communications with Base Command revealed the dangerous gap between training doctrine and adaptive crisis response. Base Command, request immediate tactical support and extraction for civilian personnel, Johansson radioed, his voice betraying stress that went far beyond training exercise pressure. Enemy forces have secured multiple buildings. Standard assault protocols risk unacceptable civilian casualties. Master Sergeant Weber's response came through encrypted channels, carrying the weight of genuine operational authority rather than training evaluation. All team leaders, be advised that rescue operations are being coordinated with regional military commands. Your mission is to maintain observation and provide real-time intelligence. Do not attempt independent tactical action. Repeat, maintain positions and observe only. The order made perfect tactical sense from a command perspective. Untested candidates shouldn't attempt complex hostage rescue operations without proper support and coordination. But Alana's psychological analysis of the developing situation revealed critical factors that weren't being addressed by conventional military thinking. The enemy operatives weren't just gathering intelligence, they were systematically breaking down civilian psychological resistance through escalating intimidation tactics that would soon cross lines from interrogation into torture. Through her binoculars, Alana could see psychological pressure techniques being applied to hostages that she recognized from her training in resistance to interrogation. The operatives were using time pressure, social isolation, and graduated threats to accelerate information extraction. Based on their current methodology, they would begin physical coercion within 2 hours, and potentially lethal violence within 4 hours, if they felt their operational security was threatened. "Captain," Alana said urgently, "the psychological pressure patterns I'm observing suggest these operatives are working under extreme time constraints. They're not just gathering intelligence, they're trying to complete their operation and extract before military response forces arrive. That means civilian casualties are inevitable, unless someone disrupts their psychological control over the hostage population." Johansson's response revealed how traditional military hierarchy could become dangerously inflexible during genuine crisis situations. "Martinez, our orders are clear. We maintain observation and provide intelligence to rescue forces. We do not initiate independent action that could compromise coordinated response operations. But the psychological dynamics suggest that coordinated response will arrive too late, Alana pressed. These operatives are accelerating their timeline. By the time rescue forces coordinate and deploy, civilian casualties will be inevitable. That's speculation based on psychological theory, not tactical intelligence, Johansson replied sharply. We follow orders and trust that command has better information than we do about rescue operations. The exchange crystallized everything that had been wrong with Alana's selection experience. Her ability to read human psychology under stress, to predict behavioral patterns and anticipate crisis escalation, was being dismissed as theory by someone whose tactical training hadn't prepared him to recognize the psychological dimensions of real-world crisis situations. She was watching innocent people move toward torture and death, while military doctrine prevented her from using her specialized expertise to save them. Dr. Connor's voice crackled through a separate communication channel, using psychological evaluation frequencies to reach candidates directly. All candidates, be advised that psychological assessment continues during this emergency. Your responses to genuine crisis situations will be evaluated as part of your overall selection profile. The announcement created a moment of devastating clarity for Alana. She could follow orders, maintain her position, and allow conventional military hierarchy to handle the crisis according to established protocols. That approach would demonstrate her ability to function within command structures and follow tactical doctrine even under extreme stress, exactly the kind of institutional conformity that Special Forces selection seemed to value. Or she could trust her psychological expertise, recognize that innocent lives were at immediate risk, and take action based on her specialized knowledge of crisis psychology rather than conventional tactical doctrine. That approach would violate direct orders and challenge established command authority, potentially ending her military career but potentially saving civilian lives that conventional approaches couldn't protect. The choice represented everything her 8 weeks of selection had been building toward. Would she prove herself worthy of acceptance by conforming to expectations that ignored her greatest strengths? Or would she demonstrate that her unique capabilities were exactly what crisis situations demanded, even if military culture wasn't ready to acknowledge that reality? Through her binoculars, Alana watched an enemy operative begin psychological intimidation of a young civilian actor who was clearly terrified and unprepared for the reality of genuine hostage situation. The woman's body language showed escalating panic that would soon trigger either complete psychological breakdown or desperate resistance, both of which would provoke violent responses from captors operating under operational time pressure. Alana's specialized training allowed her to recognize something that conventional tactical observation couldn't detect: the specific psychological breaking point that would transform interrogation into torture. She had perhaps 30 minutes before irreversible escalation occurred, and conventional rescue operations wouldn't arrive for at least 2 hours. "Captain," she said quietly, "I'm going to prevent civilian casualties using psychological intervention techniques. This isn't about tactical doctrine. It's about using specialized capabilities to save innocent lives." "Martinez, you are directly ordered to maintain position and observe only," Johansson replied, his voice carrying the full weight of military authority. "Any independent action will result in immediate disciplinary measures and termination from selection." The ultimatum forced Alana to confront the fundamental question that had shaped her entire military career. Was institutional acceptance worth sacrificing everything that made her capable of extraordinary achievement? For 8 weeks, she'd tried to prove herself worthy of a system that consistently devalued her greatest strengths. Now that system was ordering her to watch innocent people suffer rather than use her expertise to save them. As she quietly gathered her equipment and prepared to disobey direct orders from her team leader, Alana realized that the moment of choice wasn't really about Special Forces selection at all. It was about whether she could live with herself if she prioritized career advancement over moral responsibility, when her unique capabilities could make the difference between life and death. The ghost in the back row was about to step forward into the brightest possible spotlight, not to prove herself worthy of acceptance, but to prove that some things were more important than acceptance from people who couldn't recognize exceptional capabilities when those capabilities could save lives. Her choice was made. Everything else was just execution. Alana Martinez disappeared from Team Alpha's observation position at 1,347 hours, leaving behind her radio equipment and a brief note that would later become part of Special Forces training doctrine. Psychological intervention required to prevent civilian casualties. Will maintain communication on emergency channels. Someone needs to use their specialized training when conventional approaches can't reach the problem. Moving through mountain terrain with skills developed during 2 decades of military service, Alana approached the village from an angle that avoided both enemy observation and friendly fire positions. Her psychological operations background had taught her to think like her adversaries, to understand their motivations and predict their responses to different types of pressure. The enemy operatives weren't random terrorists. They were professionals conducting sophisticated intelligence gathering under operational time constraints that made them predictable in specific ways. Through careful observation of their communication patterns and behavioral rhythms, Alana had identified the psychological profile of their operation. They were working under pressure from handlers who expected results within a narrow time frame. They were trained in interrogation techniques, but not in managing extended hostage situations with civilian populations. Most importantly, they were psychologically prepared for resistance from military personnel, but not for the kind of sophisticated psychological warfare that could turn their own tactics against them. Her first action was something that conventional military doctrine would never consider. She began psychological manipulation of the enemy force, rather than direct tactical engagement. Using communication equipment that she'd quietly borrowed from base supplies, Alana began transmitting false intelligence reports on frequencies she knew the enemy was monitoring. The reports were carefully crafted to create operational anxiety among the hostile operatives. She transmitted fictional communications suggesting that rapid response teams were approaching from multiple directions, that air support was en route, and that intelligence agencies had identified the operatives' extraction routes. None of it was true, but the psychological pressure was designed to accelerate enemy decision-making in ways that would create opportunities for intervention. The effect was immediate and exactly what her training had predicted. Enemy operatives began showing signs of operational stress that manifested in rushed interrogation techniques and increased tension among their leadership. Their psychological pressure on civilian hostages intensified, but it also became less controlled and more predictable, as fear drove them toward established response patterns. Alana's second action exploited the psychological vulnerability she'd created. Instead of attempting to rescue hostages through conventional tactical methods, she began manipulating the information flow that the enemy operatives were receiving from their captives. Using advanced psychological techniques, she started feeding specific intelligence to selected civilian actors' intelligence that would convince enemy forces they were wasting time on unproductive interrogation subjects. The technique required her to infiltrate the village's communication systems and establish contact with hostages without revealing her presence to their captors. Her psychological operations background had prepared her for exactly this kind of clandestine influence operation, but implementing it during a genuine crisis required adaptations that went beyond any training scenario she'd previously encountered. Moving through the village's peripheral buildings, Alana established communication with 3 civilian actors who were being held in separate locations. Using psychological techniques designed to maintain their composure under stress, she provided them with specific information to share with their captors, information that would convince the enemy operatives that their real intelligence targets were located elsewhere in the training area. "Tell them you overheard instructors discussing classified operations in Sector 5, she whispered to the first hostage, a young woman whose psychological state was approaching breakdown. "Make it sound like you're trying to be helpful but scared. They need to believe you're revealing secrets reluctantly, not deliberately misleading them." The psychological manipulation worked exactly as Alana had predicted. Enemy operatives began refocusing their attention on intelligence about fictional operations in distant sectors, reducing their immediate pressure on hostages while creating opportunities for intervention. But the technique required her to maintain constant psychological pressure on multiple targets simultaneously, coordinating false intelligence that would drive enemy decision-making without exposing her own presence. Her third action represented psychological warfare at its most sophisticated level. Instead of trying to defeat the enemy operatives through direct confrontation, Alana began turning their own operational psychology against them. She manipulated their communication with handlers, their confidence in mission parameters, and their trust in the intelligence they were gathering. Using captured enemy communication equipment, she began transmitting reports to their operational commanders that suggested the mission was compromised and extraction was necessary. The reports were carefully crafted to match enemy communication protocols while introducing doubts about operational security that would accelerate their departure timeline. Base Commandus's operational team leader she transmitted using captured encryption, imitating communication patterns she'd observed throughout the day. Civilian intelligence suggests military response is imminent. Recommend immediate extraction with available intelligence. Continued operations risk operational security. The false communications created exactly the psychological pressure that Alana had intended. Enemy operatives began preparing for immediate departure, releasing psychological pressure on civilian hostages while consolidating their personnel for extraction. But they were also becoming more dangerous, as operational stress increased their willingness to use violence to secure their withdrawal. Alana's fourth action required her to exploit the narrow window of opportunity that her psychological manipulation had created. As enemy operatives prepared for extraction, they were focusing on consolidating intelligence and ensuring operational security, rather than maintaining tight control over civilian hostages. She used this tactical shift to begin actual rescue operations, but through psychological methods rather than conventional military techniques. Instead of attempting armed rescue that could trigger violent responses, Alana began psychological liberation of hostages. She used communication techniques developed during her psychological operations training to coordinate civilian behavior, creating conditions where hostages could self-extract while enemy attention was focused on departure preparations. Listen carefully, she radioed to hostages using emergency frequencies. In exactly 3 minutes, your captors will be distracted by extraction coordination. When I give the signal, move toward the eastern building exits. Stay low, move quietly, and don't attempt to help anyone else. Individual escape, not group rescue. The technique required precise timing and understanding of enemy psychological patterns, but it offered the possibility of civilian liberation without the devastating casualties that conventional tactical rescue could produce. Alana was conducting the most sophisticated psychological warfare operation of her career, using every technique she'd learned during 2 decades of military service to achieve objectives that conventional approaches couldn't reach. As enemy operatives prepared for extraction and civilian hostages prepared for escape, Alana faced the final phase of her defiant action. She had successfully used psychological warfare to disrupt enemy operations and create rescue opportunities. But she was also completely alone, operating without support, and facing operatives who would become extremely dangerous if they realized how thoroughly their operation had been compromised. The defiant action had worked exactly as her specialized training suggested it would, but now came the most dangerous part: ensuring that her psychological manipulation translated into actual civilian rescue, without triggering the kind of violent response that could turn tactical success into human catastrophe. Everything depended on perfect execution of psychological techniques that conventional military training didn't even acknowledge as legitimate tactical options. By 1,530 hours, Alana had successfully manipulated 7 of the 12 enemy operatives into abandoning their original mission parameters and preparing for emergency extraction. Her psychological warfare campaign had convinced them that American rapid response teams were approaching from multiple vectors, that their intelligence gathering operation was compromised, and that continued operations risked capture or elimination. But her success had also created a new and potentially more dangerous situation. Desperate operatives operating under extreme psychological pressure were capable of unpredictable and devastating violence. The remaining 5 enemy operatives, led by what appeared to be their most experienced commander, had recognized that something was systematically undermining their operation. Instead of falling for Alana's psychological manipulations, they had consolidated control over the most valuable civilian hostages and prepared for a defensive stand that could result in mass casualties if conventional rescue operations attempted to resolve the situation through direct assault. Through intercepted communications, Alana discovered the true scope of the odds she was facing. The enemy commander had identified discrepancies in the intelligence his operatives were receiving, recognized that their communication security had been compromised, and concluded that American forces were conducting sophisticated psychological operations designed to force premature extraction. His response was strategically brilliant and tactically terrifying. He would use remaining hostages as human shields while conducting systematic torture designed to force American rescue attempts that could be documented for propaganda purposes. Unknown American operative came a transmission on emergency frequencies that sent chills through Alana's equipment. "We know you are conducting psychological warfare against our operation. You have precisely 30 minutes to surrender yourself, or we begin executing civilian hostages every 10 minutes until you present yourself for capture." The ultimatum revealed the full psychological sophistication of the enemy commander. He had recognized that someone was manipulating his operation, identified that the psychological pressure was coming from a single source, and designed a counter-strategy that would force that source to choose between personal safety and civilian lives. It informed emergency responders about incoming civilian casualties who would need immediate medical attention. Most critically, it demonstrated to enemy operatives that their psychological assessment of her capabilities had been fundamentally incorrect. The enemy commander's response to her broadcast revealed the complete psychological breakdown that her warfare campaign had achieved. Instead of adapting to her tactical innovations, he fell back on conventional intimidation that made him completely predictable to someone with her psychological training. "Impossible," he transmitted on intercepted frequencies, his voice carrying stress indicators that suggested approaching psychological breakdown. "Individual operative cannot conduct systematic psychological warfare against trained unit. This is elaborate bluff designed to force tactical errors." His denial of her capabilities provided Alana with the final tactical advantage she needed. The commander's conventional military thinking prevented him from accepting that he had been outmaneuvered by methodologies his training didn't acknowledge as legitimate. His psychological inflexibility would make his final responses predictable and exploitable. At 1,549 hours, Alana initiated the coordinated civilian escape that would determine whether 8 weeks of being underestimated had prepared her for the most complex psychological operation of her military career. Using precise timing developed through her psychological warfare campaign, she began simultaneous implementation of multiple tactical innovations that conventional military doctrine had never attempted. "Authentication confirmed," she transmitted to civilian hostages on emergency frequencies. "Execute escape procedures now. Eastern exits, individual movement, no assistance to others." Simultaneously, she transmitted false intelligence to enemy operatives suggesting that American rapid response teams were beginning tactical assault from multiple vectors. The false communications were designed to focus enemy attention on external threats rather than internal hostage movements. "All enemy personnel American assault teams have breached perimeter security. Defensive positions required immediately. Hostage security is secondary to operational survival." The psychological manipulation worked with devastating precision. Enemy operatives abandoned hostage control to respond to fictional threats that existed only in their psychologically compromised assessment of tactical reality. Civilian hostages began coordinated escape while their captors focused on defensive preparations against American forces that weren't actually approaching. Within 3 minutes, 7 of the 9 remaining civilian hostages had successfully escaped enemy control and reached positions where incoming medical teams could provide immediate assistance. The psychological warfare campaign had achieved tactical objectives that conventional military rescue operations couldn't have accomplished without significant casualties. But the turning point also created the most dangerous moment of the entire crisis. The enemy commander, realizing that his operation had been systematically dismantled through psychological warfare he couldn't counter, was preparing for a final desperate action that could still result in catastrophic violence. Through intercepted communications, Alana heard him coordinating with his 2 remaining operatives for what appeared to be a suicide attack designed to eliminate remaining evidence of their failed operation while maximizing American casualties for propaganda purposes. The turning point had been achieved, civilian lives had been saved, and enemy tactical capabilities had been systematically destroyed through psychological warfare. But the victory was incomplete, and the final phase would test whether her innovative methodologies could prevent desperate enemies from turning tactical defeat into strategic catastrophe through final acts of violence that conventional doctrine couldn't anticipate or prevent. Everything now depended on psychological insights that would either complete her unprecedented tactical success or reveal the limitations of individual innovation when facing enemies whose desperation made them capable of unpredictable and devastating final actions. The final confrontation began at 1,552 hours, when the enemy commander, his psychological warfare capabilities completely compromised, and his tactical authority systematically undermined, made the decision that would either validate or destroy 8 weeks of military cultural assumptions about emotional intelligence in combat operations. Instead of attempting conventional escape or tactical withdrawal, he chose to implement a suicide attack designed to eliminate evidence of his operational failure, while creating maximum psychological impact on American military personnel. Final operational directive, his voice transmitted to remaining operatives, carrying the psychological stress indicators that confirmed complete breakdown of tactical reasoning. Mission parameters are no longer achievable through conventional methods. Implementation of terminal protocols required to prevent operational intelligence from reaching American command structure. Alana recognized immediately that conventional tactical thinking would be helpless against enemies whose desperation had pushed them beyond rational self-preservation. The 2 remaining operatives were preparing to detonate explosive devices that would eliminate remaining evidence while killing themselves and any Americans in the immediate area. Their psychological state had moved beyond negotiation, intimidation, or tactical maneuvering into pure, destructive intent that conventional military doctrine couldn't address. Her response required the ultimate application of psychological warfare methodology. She would need to manipulate suicidal enemies into choosing different forms of destruction that would spare innocent lives while still satisfying their psychological need for operational conclusion. The technique demanded understanding of human psychology at levels that exceeded anything in military training manuals. Enemy commander, she transmitted on emergency frequencies, using psychological manipulation techniques designed to exploit his compromised mental state. Your operational security has already been completely compromised. American intelligence agencies have recorded every aspect of your mission methodology. Your suicide attack will provide no additional operational security, while eliminating valuable intelligence assets that could be exchanged for operational considerations. Quote, the psychological manipulation was designed to convince him that suicide would be operationally counterproductive rather than tactically necessary. Instead of dying to protect secrets that were already compromised, he could live to negotiate advantages that might still be achievable through intelligence exchange. But the technique required her to simultaneously manipulate his remaining operatives, who were following his orders rather than making independent psychological assessments. She began targeted psychological warfare designed to break down their commitment to suicide operations while providing alternative actions that would satisfy their psychological need for operational conclusion. All enemy operatives, she transmitted using captured command frequencies. Operational intelligence suggests American forces are prepared to negotiate prisoner exchange for valuable intelligence about regional operations. Terminal protocols would eliminate negotiation opportunities that could achieve strategic objectives beyond current mission parameters. The psychological manipulation worked exactly as her training predicted. Enemy operatives began questioning whether suicide operations were strategically necessary or tactically counterproductive, given the compromised state of their mission security. Their psychological commitment to terminal protocols weakened as alternative possibilities emerged that could satisfy operational requirements without requiring self-destruction. At 1,554 hours, Master Sergeant Weber's voice crackled through communication channels as he witnessed the impossible tactical situation that Alana's psychological warfare had created. Trained enemy operatives were surrendering rather than implementing suicide attacks. Civilian hostages had been successfully liberated without conventional rescue operations, and a crisis that should have resulted in mass casualties was being resolved through methodologies that conventional military training didn't even acknowledge as legitimate tactical options. All teams, enemy surrender is in progress, Weber transmitted, his voice carrying amazement at tactical developments that exceeded his understanding of possible outcomes. Hostage liberation achieved with 0 casualties. Psychological warfare operations have achieved complete tactical success through unprecedented methodologies. Dr. Connor's voice followed immediately, carrying vindication that reached far beyond individual performance evaluation. Command Staff Sergeant Martinez has demonstrated tactical innovation that represents evolution in psychological warfare methodology. Her achievement under genuine crisis conditions validates capabilities that conventional selection criteria failed to recognize. The vindication continued as Base Command received tactical intelligence that revealed the full scope of what Alana's individual psychological warfare campaign had accomplished. 12 enemy operatives had been neutralized or captured without conventional military engagement. 9 civilian hostages had been liberated without rescue operations that could have resulted in casualties. Critical intelligence about enemy psychological warfare capabilities had been gathered through innovative techniques that could be incorporated into future tactical training. But the most profound vindication came from Captain Johansson's transmission as he witnessed tactical success achieved through methodologies his conventional training had taught him to dismiss. Base Command, Sergeant Martinez has accomplished mission objectives that conventional tactical doctrine couldn't have achieved. Her psychological warfare capabilities represent exactly the kind of innovative thinking that modern warfare demands. The transformation was immediate and comprehensive. Military personnel who had spent 8 weeks questioning Alana's emotional stability were now documenting her psychological warfare innovations for incorporation into Special Forces training curriculum. Selection criteria that had emphasized conventional tactical thinking were being revised to include psychological operations capabilities that could achieve strategic objectives beyond traditional military methodologies. As enemy operatives completed their surrender and civilian hostages received medical attention, Alana faced the final evaluation that would determine not just her individual selection status, but the military's willingness to embrace psychological warfare innovations that challenged fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness. Master Sergeant Weber approached her position as she secured captured enemy equipment and prepared intelligence reports that would influence psychological warfare training for decades. His expression carried recognition that went far beyond conventional performance assessment. "Martinez," he said quietly, "you've demonstrated capabilities that exceed our selection criteria and tactical methodologies that challenge our training doctrine. The question isn't whether you've earned the Green Beret. The question is whether we're capable of adapting our culture to utilize what you've proven possible." 3 months later, at age 45, Alana Martinez became the oldest woman in European military history to receive the Green Beret. But more importantly, she became the first psychological warfare specialist to design tactical training curriculum that integrated emotional intelligence with conventional military methodology. Her achievement proved that strength wasn't just about emotional suppression. It was about emotional intelligence, sophisticated enough to manipulate enemy psychology while protecting innocent lives. The ghost in the back row had become a tactical innovator whose methodologies would save lives in conflicts that conventional thinking couldn't even anticipate. Sometimes the military's greatest asset was exactly the person they'd spent years underestimating. And sometimes being too soft for war meant being sophisticated enough to win battles without firing a shot. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.